Ora.
Ai, morena e tātou mā. I tēnei te wiki o te reo Māori. He rangi moko puna tēnei tūranganui a Kiwa. Tēnā tātou kua whakarau i ka mai a ipurangi nei. Ki te āta wete wete i ngā kaupapa mo te mahere whakamua o te kaunihira o te tairāwhiti. Mo te tau 2021 ki te tau 2031. Ko ngā kaupapa kōrero i te rā nei e hāngai ana ki te whakatipu i te taupori me ngā whare noho. Mena rawa e hihi ana tātou ki ētahi reini kai whakarite Māori. No mai haere mai everyone. The Gisborne District Council would like to extend a warm welcome to you all and thank you for connecting to this online hui about a few of the topics we're seeking your feedback on for our 2021 to 2031 long-term plan, also referred to as the LTP. The LTP sets out our work for the next 10 years. This webinar begins with presentations, followed by a question and answer section at the end. Thank you to those who have submitted your questions via Facebook and email. And if you want to ask a question live, please do so in the chat function below, along with an email address in case we can't respond to you live. If you're watching the replay of this webinar and you have a question, please send it to feedback@gdc.govt.nz. Okay, so today we're talking about our community outcomes. Our webinar begins today with a presentation firstly from Janic Slupski, Senior Policy Advisor in Strategic Planning, talking to us about population growth and Council's role in supporting housing and infrastructure to meet the demands of this growth. Tuarua mai, secondly, we will hear from James Baty, Director of Internal Partnerships, who will be talking to us about the potential of Māori wards. Tēnā kōrua, that's enough from me. I now hand over to you both.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thanks, Marere. Morena tātou. Thanks for tuning in. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, how's that looking for everybody? Goodbye. Cool. Okay, housing and population growth. Big topical issue for us right now. No surprises. Actually, the only surprise really is that it didn't happen any sooner. This is a fantastic place to live. It's a wonderful landscape, beautiful culture, lifestyle. And I guess, you know, at the end of it all, it's reflected in the steady population growth that we're seeing at the moment. The result is we're enjoying quite a lot of economic benefits from this, but it also puts increasing demands on our housing and infrastructure. Council has a job to play in that space by providing infrastructure and planning support to enable the housing developments to occur. So what are we going to cover? We're going to quickly go over the stats in terms of population growth. We'll take a quick look at building consents, what's involved, what we will need to do around the planning process, and some kōrero around infrastructure for subdivisions. So just in terms of some population statistics, as you can see from that small table, our population has been steadily tracking upwards over recent years, both for Māori and the population as a whole. And what this has done is put continued pressure on our existing housing supply. What's a really important point to make here is that the growth is concentrated on Gisborne City. We haven't seen the same trend in our rural settlements yet. However, housing is still an issue up the coast without the growth. So it's not just an urban issue, it's an issue for our rural communities as well. And that was something that came out of the kōrero that we had in Hui through the spatial planning exercises that we did last year. Interestingly, the demographic is changing too. So it's not just a numbers game. We're getting older. The kids have grown up, have moved out of the region, or they've moved into their own place. So 71% of the almost 1,700 additional households that we're expecting over the next 20 years will be of 2 people or less. So we're talking about smaller households, not larger. And what that means is that we need smaller homes to be built in the future, not larger ones. From the recent Manaki Tairāwhiti Housing Stocktake report, It's identified a current shortage of around 400 homes in the region. 86% of new dwellings being constructed are 4 bedrooms or larger. So there's a bit of a disconnect between what actually we need going forward and what we're actually building going right now in the ground. We also know that supply is slow to respond. It's unable to keep up with the demand that's been driven by population growth, and that's after decades of stability. Our long-term aspiration is to have a planning system and smooth infrastructure delivery that makes it both economic and efficient to build homes for our people. It means reducing the wedge between the high cost of building on one side and the cost of the existing housing stock on the other. What's a really interesting proxy for housing pressure is our housing register, which measures the wait list for social housing. And the register has actually grown really quickly over recent years. So in 2014, it was less than 50. In 2019, it was 235. Much of the demand is for the smaller units. Much of the housing supply that we have is actually 4 bedrooms plus. So again, we need to somehow work out that disconnect. We know as well that if our horticulture and productive zone is doing well, then we need housing to support our seasonal workers. They're another bracket of our community that we need to provide for. The other thing is, of course, is that while the cost to build in Gisborne is actually comparable to national rates, the cost of a new home is actually quite high compared to the prices of existing homes. So the cost of land plus build, that's excluding infrastructure, consenting on all those other costs. For an average new home, it's around $550,000 compared to buying an existing home for around $350,000 to $400,000. Okay, so building consents. Our building services work is required to meet our obligations under the Building Act 2004. Building services work is about ensuring that the buildings are safe for people to live and work in, that our people wanting to build or buy a property have access to the information that they need to make an informed choice. Our work in this area provides building consents, code of compliance certificates, and land information memoranda. They're what we call LIM reports. They also need accurate and timely information on building consent processes. Our team monitors compliance of building warrants of fitness for commercial buildings. They provide responses to service requests relating to stormwater. They assess and follow up on the strengthening of earthquake-prone buildings. And they provide 3 yearly swimming pool inspections as well to make sure that our swimming pools are safe. At the moment, our council team for building consents consists of around 13 to 14 FTEs. And they go through around 820 building consents a year. On top of that, they also process around 750 code of compliance certificates and about 100 LIM reports. So they're really, really flat out. Currently, the building consent team also process consents around 90–95% of the 20-day time frame. The average time frame for them to process a consent is around 11.5 days, which is pretty good. Under a growth scenario, if the number of building consents lodged annually increased, then council would need more resources to process the increase in consent applications. There's a few options available to us as well in terms of how we manage that growth. We might need to start putting effort into developing trainees rather than recruiting qualified inspectors. Virtual inspections, online applications, and other ways to use digital technology may help to speed up the process as well. An option also exists for consents to be processed remotely by contract processors, and they may be out-of-towners. The downside of this is the loss of local contact. And it's really hard to find the resource as we're so busy as well. The whole country is going through a bit of a growth phase at the moment. Housing is a big issue right across the country, and so it's no surprise that building inspectors are in hot demand So competing for those on the markets, it's a tough challenge for us. As mentioned, we need to lift the number of dwelling consents processed to about 150 a year, and that's from around 100 that we process at the moment, so another 50. In order to meet that capacity, we would probably need about another full-time equivalent to process consents. And that's assuming that we don't get any change of requirements under the Building Act or any other legislation. So in terms of zoning, the zoning relates to our planning framework, which is what we call the Tairāwhiti Resource Management Plan, or TRMP. Currently, the TRMP is not enabling our community's aspirations for a high quality urban environment and access to good affordable housing. What's more than that, it doesn't provide certainty for plan users, whether they're using it once or whether they're some more of our frequent flyers. And actually, the TRMP uses up quite a lot of staff time in terms of interpreting provisions that were written 20 plus years ago for the benefit of our current community. So there's a lag in how our provisions are able to be fit for purpose in the current climate. Here's an example. So a current plan requires the same high level of scrutiny for really, really small activities such as building a garden shed in a rural zone as it does for significant activities like subdivision or commercial activities on productive land or forestry harvesting on marginal land. So you're talking about quite different activities and levels of risk, but the same amount of time and commitment to processing those applications. So the main thing here is that we're actually looking at ways that we can deliver a review of our full planning framework, timeframes, resourcing, how we can do this effectively over time in order to support our community outcomes, and in particular our housing outcomes. And so part of this would involve taking a look at our zoning rules for residential development and subdivision and seeing how we can amend them to better support our housing outcomes and our housing challenges now. So what would the planning framework look like, or what would we need to do to our planning framework in order to accommodate growth? So there's an increasing focus on the zoning process, and that would form part of an approach to incentivizing the supply side of housing. So zoning determines what activities that we can expect on a piece of land. Residential zoning means a house can be built without resource consent on that zone. Commercial zoning means that certain businesses can be established without resource consent. So you're trying to pair up the activity with the zoning to make it easier for people to do their thing. We can also zone land for increased density. So for example, medium density residential zones could allow houses which are 2 stories to be built without a resource consent. So we'd provide zoning for that kind of activity. And that would provide for infill housing and a more denser urban environment around the city. And the good thing about that for higher density is that it allows houses to be built more efficiently and provide for more people than the current model, which is one large detached house on one large quarter-acre section right across the city. To speed up the zoning process, we'd need more resources to be directed out our planning and policy team so we can complete the TRMP review. And that's a major challenge. It's a multi-year process. It's technical, it's complicated. But if we prioritize it, then we can undertake that work, and then we can start looking at the housing provisions, and perhaps the way forward is through our long-term planning process. So in terms of our statistics for infrastructure around subdivision, redevelopment of existing urban areas alongside greenfield development, they're both needed to provide for growth and increase the availability and diversity of affordable and healthy housing. So there are 2 areas. So there's the greenfields and then there's the infill housing. So redevelopment or intensification both need the right kind of infrastructure to be in place at the right time. So it's not just putting it in the right place, it's actually timing it as well So early indications of that current infrastructure services, particularly our ability to provide wastewater, might be constraining the ability to increase the number of houses in some areas. As we know, infrastructure is really expensive to build and it's really expensive to maintain as well. The most important council infrastructure for enabling more houses to be built is wastewater, water supply and roading. Community facilities and managing stormwaters, they're also really important, but they're not the biggest barrier to housing. So if we take a look at the circle graph on the slide, here's an example of how much work we need to do in a typical greenfield subdivision of 400 houses. So this one here is for the Tarihiru block, which is not far away from the hospital, if you know where that is. So if you're looking at all of your wastewater component, your transport component, your water supply, and your swales and pipes, you're talking around about an investment of $17 million for 400 new houses. Some of the transport projects could be part funded by NZTA as part of the local share, but council needs to fund most of this work. And this example is based on the Tarihiru block. Costs are going to vary, but this is a pretty good picture of the infrastructure costs that are in front of us. So the stats around growth, who pays? We currently rely on development contributions to fund infrastructure for new subdivisions. This means growth pays for growth. So when growth is slow, we actually have to wait quite a long time until we've got enough money to fund new infrastructure. That's a challenge. It means that it can take quite a long time for houses to be built on areas zoned for residential use. And that's kind of what we've seen in the past. So over the last 8 years, revenue from DCs has been significantly lower than what we actually expected. We expected to receive nearly 6 million in development contribution revenue, but we actually got about half of that. Is infrastructure support for housing right? So providing the right infrastructure means land is able to be developed for housing or business use as long as the right zoning and plan provisions are in place. So to provide development capacity, both have to be in place. Under the National Policy Statement for Urban Development 2020, so this is a new piece of government legislation, we will be infrastructure ready if in the here and now, we have existing infrastructure and it's adequate to support the development of land, as well as we have modelling in place to show where we might develop. Over the next 10 years, that's through our long-term planning process, that's the focus area, we'd have the funding for infrastructure to support development of land. And in the long-term picture, we're talking about 2031 and beyond, this is where our infrastructure strategy kicks in particular. We'd have the infrastructure to support development identified, and then we can put together a long-term picture or plan to fund that. And so when the future comes, we are ready, our funding is ready to support that development. Just in terms of investing in infrastructure delivery, there's a few options to consider. We could consider high development contributions. Early indications are that if we double the current development contributions, it means we'd collect enough money to proceed with a development like the Tarihiru block, and that would be as currently planned. But this would also increase the cost to developers, and as we know, the developers pass the cost on to the home buyers. That could actually end up being a disincentive to development. So there's a bit of a balance there. Plus, we have no guarantee that we'll actually collect as much as we predicted. We could borrow more. We could increase how much we borrow and spread the cost over future years, paid for by rates and future generations, as well as those directly benefiting in the short term. Rates of interest on borrowing are pretty low at the moment, but they could go up in the future. That's a risk that we have to consider. Partnerships, we could look for partnerships or ask developers to fund infrastructure for growth. We can still investigate this option if we choose one of the other options as well. So it's a supporting option. it's worth considering the status quo as well, which is we could continue the current approach, but we may have delay when we build new infrastructure if we've not collected enough money. So it's worth thinking about where we are now and comparing it to our other options. There's another option which is worth talking about as well, which is the specified development projects. Kāinga Order has powers under the Urban Development Act to raise money for infrastructure for a specified development project area. Part of its toolbox includes setting targeted rates, requiring development contributions, betterment payments or infrastructure charges. And in this instance, Kāinga Order would actually be constructing the required infrastructure. So they would be a major player in the development of housing through those areas and those projects. What else could we do to support housing? Realize it's a big issue for our communities at the moment. It's one that requires collaboration. I think this is the main thing, is that Council has a couple of tools in terms of the provision of infrastructure and the planning framework to support housing, but there's the market side as well in terms of the construction and the delivery of the housing stock themselves. So we need lots of players coming in and collaborating at once. We're keen to hear what the public think and what we could do to further support housing across Tairāwhiti as well. Are there areas you think are suitable for redevelopment or more housing? Are there other ways of funding development infrastructure? Is enabling housing development an important role for Council? How far should we go to support this really, really important piece of work? Anyway, that's my last slide. Many thanks. Until next time, take care. Be kind. I'll hand it over. Kia ora.
Thank you, Janic. And if you had any questions for Janic at this stage, please place them in the chat window. If you're watching this replay, you can send your questions to feedback@gdc.govt.nz and we will make sure to have an answer for you. We will now switch the kaupapa. We're going to hear now from James Baty, Director of Internal Partnerships. And kei te kōrero, James, e pā ana ki ngā kaiwhakarite Māori, whether or not we want to have Māori wards. So I hand over to you now. James, thank you.
Tēnā koe mārere, kia ora tātou katoa o tira me mihi ka tika I tēnei wiki o te reo Māori kia koutou. Ko ai ahau, ko James Baty ahau, I te taha o tōku māma, no whangarā mai tāpiti, no Ngāti Konohi, no tōrere nui ārua, no Ngaitai, no tawapata one nui ki te māhia, no Ngātihi Kairo rongo mai wahine. I te taha o tōku pāpa, so on my father's side, I actually whakapapa back to Roxburghshire in Scotland. So that's my Baty side. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Hopefully I don't have any issues doing this. Bear with. Kia ora. So, as I said, my name's James Baty. I am the Director of Internal Partnerships here at the Gisborne District Council. Part of my role and my team's role is that we look after the governance and democracy environment. And a part of that involves looking after elections, by-elections, polls, so on and so forth, including kōrero on Māori representation. So I'm going to be presenting today on our Māori representation, tō tātou kai whakarite Māori. So what we will cover today, I've decided perhaps the best way of dealing with a kōrero centred on Māori wards is to use a number of frequently asked questions. Māori wards and the legislation that underpins it can be a bit complex, and I'm going to do my best to step us through a kōrero on Māori wards and the legislative requirements, etc. And I apologise in advance. It will be a little bit death by PowerPoint, but hopefully I've structured in a way that we can have a good kōrero. I'm going to talk about some relevant considerations also, key considerations that underpin Māori wards. I'm going to paint a picture about the national context currently surrounding Māori wards and a bit of history in terms of Māori wards across the nation. And finally, I'm going to end with a case study on Wairoa District Council. It's an interesting case study. I'll note in advance that I was previously the electoral officer for Wairoa District Council, and during that time I was the electoral officer for 2 polls on Māori wards, and so a lot of my knowledge about Māori wards comes from that experience. Righto, here we go. So why do we have the option to establish Māori wards? So Māori wards was developed by Parliament to enhance the role of Māori in local government. In addition, there's a requirement under the Local Government Act for Council to establish and maintain processes to provide opportunities for Māori to contribute to decision-making processes. You'll notice as I go through the presentation that there are 2 key pieces of legislation that I'll be referring to. One is the Local Government Act, and the other one is the Local Electoral Act. There are lots of requirements in terms of connecting with Māori under both of those pieces of legislation, but I've highlighted this particular one because I think it's the one that's most connected to the kaupapa of Māori wards. But there are lots of other pieces of legislation, and I'm going to note some of those now for you as well. You know, what other obligations does council have in regards to Māori? Other examples include that the council and the Crown have a responsibility to take appropriate account of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi and to maintain and improve opportunities for Māori to contribute to local government decision-making processes. So that's in Section 4 of the Local Government Act. A local authority should also provide opportunities for Māori to contribute to its decision-making processes. So this is dotted throughout the legislation. 14D, Section 81 is another one. We need to consider ways in which council can foster the development of Māori capacity to contribute to decision-making processes. And councils need to take into account the relationship of Māori and their culture and traditions with their ancestral lands, water, sites, wāhi tapu, valued flora and fauna, and other taonga. So why are we discussing Māori wards now? Under the Local Electoral Act, council has the opportunity now to introduce designated Māori representation through setting up of 1 or more Māori wards, and these would be in addition to general wards. The Local Government Commission, they've stated recently that given councils, and you'll note that it's councils plural, so all councils' obligations under the Local Government Act in terms of Māori participation, they say that the option of Māori wards warrants careful consideration. So that's another reason we're discussing Māori wards at the moment. And in terms of Gisborne District Council, on the 13th of August, council agreed that it should engage with the public on the possible introduction of Māori wards in Tairāwhiti. So I'm going to rattle off some key considerations, and what I want to say about these is that I've gathered these across the local government sector. So Māori wards and discussion on Māori wards and polls on Māori wards have been happening for quite a number of years now, and what I've digested from the research that I've done is the key considerations that sort of run as a theme through those discussions. And I just want to pop those up on the screen as we go along for us to bear in mind in terms of the rest of this presentation. So Māori wards are intended to represent the importance of the Māori community voice and to provide assurance that issues of priority to Māori can be directly brought to the table. Māori wards are a way of ensuring Māori voices in the community are heard where otherwise representation would be hard to achieve. Māori ward representatives may better relate to and understand Māori communities and therefore provide the council with a greater understanding of Māori issues and Māori concerns. And Māori wards may encourage more Māori to participate in council, for example, standing for office or standing for election, and also voting at local elections. Māori wards are intended to promote confidence in local government decision-making processes. So not to forget that we've got a lot of legislation that requires specific engagement with Māori on a number of different kaupapa. And so there's a confidence that can be brought to those decision-making processes with the requisite Māori representation, and knowing that where there are a distinctive Māori perspective on related matters, that someone will be able to interpret and weigh up those associated issues. Māori make up nearly 50% of the population in Tairawhiti, but this is not reflected in the current representation on council. Māori do have an equal right to stand for council and to vote at local elections, and therefore may not need separate electoral representation. So that's kind of the flip side. And council could improve opportunities for Māori to contribute to decision making by other means, such as through Māori consultative groups or appointments to committees. So Gisborne District Council has got a number of examples of that already. So what are Māori wards? Quite simply, they're similar to Māori parliamentary seats that we have for national elections, and Māori wards establish areas where only those on the Māori roll vote for the candidates. What's the Māori roll? Well, an electoral roll is a list of people who are enrolled to vote, and in New Zealand we have two rolls, the Māori roll and the general roll. So Māori roll or general roll. If you're a Māori, you can choose between the Māori roll or the general roll, and when you first enroll. But once you've enrolled, you can only change roles during the Māori electoral option, and that usually happens every 5 years. If you're already enrolled, the next opportunity to change roles is in 2024, and that's because the last option was in 2018. So I took a little bit of a snip from the current enrolment form. So it's this area here. In step 4, where you say, I'm of Māori descent, please enrol me on the Māori roll. I'm of Māori descent, please enrol me on the general roll. I am not of Māori descent, you will be enrolled on the general roll. The other important part is that you do a declaration. So the important part here is that the information that you provide is true and correct, and that you understand that giving false or misleading information is a criminal offence. That's the enrolment on either of those roles. So what would the voting arrangements be if Māori wards were established? So it's pretty straightforward. People enrolled on the Māori electoral roll will only be able to vote for people in the Māori wards, and vice versa. People enrolled on the general roll would only vote for members of the general ward and not for people in the Māori ward. What about voting for the mayor? Don't fear. Everyone votes for the mayor. So it doesn't matter what ward structure we have or what wards we have, it's an election at large for the mayor. Interesting question. Do you have to be of Māori descent to stand as a candidate in a Māori ward? This is probably one of the most misunderstood things about Māori wards. And the answer is no. So you don't have to be of Māori descent to stand as a councillor in a Māori ward. But what the law does require is that a person who is eligible to stand is that they have to be eligible to stand, and they must be nominated by 2 electors on the Māori roll within the respective area that they are standing for. So that's no different for any wards like the wards we currently have. If you stand as a councillor in Tawhiti Uwawa ward, then you require nomination from people on the electoral roll for that ward. The same would apply if you were standing in a Māori ward, but you don't have to actually be a Māori to be a candidate in a Māori ward. So this is just an example that I pinched from Wairoa District. So this is the key part here. We, the undersigned electors of the Māori ward, and nominate, and they put the candidate there. And it can be anyone who's eligible to stand as a candidate, and they sign their signatures over here. So 2 people from on the Māori electoral roll for that particular Māori ward. So who can stand for election? This applies to all the wards, including a Māori ward or a general ward. To be eligible to stand for election, the candidate must be a New Zealand citizen, either by birth or through a citizenship ceremony, and enrolled as a parliamentary elector anywhere in New Zealand, and nominated by the two electors whose name appear on the electoral roll from within the respective area that the candidate is standing for. And importantly, candidates cannot stand for both general and Māori wards at the same time. How many councillors would there be? So the number of councillors elected from one or more Māori wards depends on a very complicated formula. It's not that complicated. It does look like a bit of a mathematical equation. If you're interested, you can have a look at Schedule 1A of the Local Electoral Act, but essentially it's based on the Māori and general electoral populations for the district, and it's relative to the number of councillors. So in Gisborne's case, the Māori electoral population is over 17,000 and the general electoral population is close to 30,000, and that's based on the 2018 census. And assuming that we kept the same number of councillors plus the mayor, what that would mean when you use that calculation is that 5 councillors would need to be elected from one or more Māori wards, and 8 councillors would be elected from one or more general wards. You'll notice that we use quite often that terminology, one or more wards, and that's because there are lots of different ways that you can construct your ward structure, and that'll be the subject of a representation review process. I couldn't help myself. I did throw up the formula. That is the formula for determining the number of Māori ward councillors. So who will Māori ward councillors represent? Once elected, Māori ward councillors have the same responsibility as all other councillors. They're required to represent the community as a whole, the entire community. So I think of Māori wards, or any wards for that matter, as the means by which you get to the council table. Once you are there, you're required, like all councillors, to do the same job. In fact, councillors are required to make a declaration. They take an oath when they take office, and in that declaration, they affirm that they will carry out their duties in the best interests of the whole community. Does having Māori ward councillors mean that council only needs to discuss matters impacting on Māori with them alone? This is another misconception, I think, around Māori wards. I think there is a belief that once you have Māori ward councillors, that all things Māori begin and end with the Māori councillors. The answer is no. So Māori ward councillors, as I said earlier, have the same responsibility as other councillors under various pieces of legislation to engage Māori in decision-making processes. They are not a substitute for Māori individuals, whānau, hapu, iwi, tangata whenua, mana whenua, etc. in respect of council's obligations to consult and engage with Māori. So once you're a councillor, all the legislative requirements apply to you equally in terms of the way that you engage with community, whether it be Māori or non-Māori. Does council need to make a decision on establishing Māori wards? The final consideration of Māori wards is in fact optional. So there isn't a requirement in the here and now for council to decide on Māori wards. It's an optional decision. Council may resolve to introduce Māori wards for the next 2 triennial elections, so the elections in 2022 and 2025. Importantly, if council decides to introduce Māori wards and makes a resolution to that effect, and they want it to be for the 2022 elections, it has to make that decision before the 23rd of November this year. So that's if they just straight out resolve, we want to establish Māori wards. Equally, 5% of electors enrolled at the previous triennial elections can do what we call a poll demand. So they sign a petition following a certain format. Currently, 5% of our electors is 1,625 electors, and that can force council to hold a poll or a referendum on the issue of Māori wards. It's a really important slide here. What decision options does Gisborne District Council have for Māori wards? First, council can decide to do nothing, and there's no public notice required of that decision. If they do nothing, effectively what that means is the status quo remains, and effectively no Māori wards. Council could just make a resolution to establish Māori wards, and as I said earlier, if they want that decision to affect the 2022 elections, they need to make that decision before the 23rd of November this year. If they do decide to establish Māori wards by way of council resolution, they must serve public notice. I think that's 7 days, within 7 days of the decision. There are requirements surrounding that public notice. They have to give notice of the resolution itself, and they also have to provide notification of the option of 5% of electors to demand a poll if they wanted to. So that's to countermand council's decision to establish Māori wards. And there's a whole process, and I'll talk about polls shortly. Or council itself could go straight to a poll. So without this requirement of, without the necessity of 5% of electors. So council can do nothing, council can establish Māori wards, or council could just choose to send it to a poll themselves. So what is a poll? Pretty straightforward. A poll is just like a referendum. It's a vote on a proposal or a question. Nationally, we've got 2 coming up as part of the elections on cannabis legislation and control and the end of life choice. So it's much the same. The example here in terms of Māori wards is you could hold a poll. I vote for the establishment of Māori wards, or I vote against the establishment of Māori wards. So that's only if a poll is held. When can a poll on Māori wards be held? So Gisborne District Council, as I said, can resolve to hold one at any time, and 5% of electors can force a poll. But is a poll actually required? It's only required if Gisborne District Council resolves to hold one, or whether 5% of the electors demand one. If council decides to establish Māori wards and gives public notice of that fact and gives people an opportunity to raise a poll demand, and that doesn't occur, then Māori wards are required to be established. I'm going to give some examples later about how these options play out, and this is the sort of complex side of the law that I was talking about. Are Māori ward polls binding? Yes. So if you hold a poll, the decision will affect the 2 future elections that follow that poll. So I don't want to, this seems really complicated, but I'll try and explain this. So if council decides to hold a poll, or there's a valid demand by 5% of electors, if we get that poll demand before the 21st of February 2021, then we have to hold the poll by May the 21st, 2021, and that'll affect the 22 and 25 elections. So a really important date, the 21st of February. If council decides after the 21st of February, or if it gets a demand for a poll from 5% of electors after the 21st of February, then the poll has to be held after the 21st of May next year, and it'll affect the next elections in 25 and 28. So timing is everything. So what happens if Māori wards are established? If a Māori ward or wards are required to be established, then the number of Māori councillors and ward boundaries will ultimately be finalised as part of a representation review. So councils are required to hold representation reviews every 6 years under the law, or earlier, for example, if we have to establish Māori wards. So currently, Gisborne District Council is not required to conduct legally another representation review until 2024. So we held one last year, unless of course Māori wards are introduced, in which case we'll need to run a representation review next year. So a rep review, very quickly, rep reviews determine the number of councillors to be elected, the basis for councillors, the election basis for councillors, and if it includes wards, then you have to do the boundaries and name the wards. So we have ward structures at the moment, got 5 wards in Gisborne. Reviews also include whether there are to be community boards, and if so, the membership arrangements for those boards. And representation arrangements are to be determined so as to provide fair and effective representation for individuals and communities. I'm going to leave rep reviews there. That's a whole nother kaupapa, but effectively, if Māori wards are to be established under any of those processes that I've talked about, so council making a resolution and no poll being required, or a poll being required of 5% of electors, or council requiring a poll, whatever the outcome of those things are, you have to go through a rep review to ultimately establish what the ward structure and membership will look like. So the national context. So there are 3 local authorities that have Māori wards at the moment. The Bay of Plenty Regional Council, they had specific legislation which required them to have Māori wards, and those were established in 2001. So they had a specific piece of legislation for theirs. Waikato Regional Council, so that was by council resolution. Council passed the resolution to establish Māori wards. They didn't receive a poll demand of 5% of electors to overturn it, and they established Māori wards as part of their 2013 elections. And Wairoa District Council. So Wairoa District Council is the only council to have Māori wards as a result of a poll. But it was an interesting journey, and I will talk about that as part of the case study at the end. So there have been a number of polls conducted, but generally they're not supported, with the recent exception of Wairoa District Council. I'm going to talk about some of those polls shortly. Several councils, New Plymouth, Palmerston North, Manawatu, Whakatane, Western Bay of Plenty, etc., they have all voted to establish Māori wards, only to have them abolished by a binding poll. So in 2018, Palmy North, 69% were against. Western Bay in 2018, 87% that was against. Whakatane in 2017, 56 were against. Wairoa District Council, 2016, 54% for. And there's a whole pile of them. I want to talk about very quickly New Plymouth District Council. So they held a poll in 2015 on Māori wards, and 83% were against. However, just recently, their councillors voted to establish Māori wards again. And so they're currently in that public notification period where they've advised the public that they wish to establish Māori wards, and there is an option for people to raise a poll demand, 5% of electors. So they're currently in that process at the moment. As Tauranga City Council recently decided by way of resolution that they would establish Māori wards as well. So they're in a public notification period as well. Hauraki, Wairoa District Council, so that was the first poll that they had on Māori wards, and it failed, 52% against, so on and so forth. So you can see quite a big history, and this isn't all of them. There's been quite a few polls on Māori wards over the year, and most of those polls, interestingly, come about following a council resolution to establish Māori wards, and then there are 5% of electors who raise a poll demand to overturn it. One of the exceptions is the 2012 Wairoa District Council poll, where council decided not to establish Māori wards, and a poll demand was brought about by 5% of electors who wanted Māori wards. I'll talk about that right now. So this is a quick case study. As I said earlier, I was the electoral officer for both the polls on Māori wards in Wairoa in 2012 and 2016. I left Wairoa District Council to come to Gisborne District Council, so on the tail end of the 2016 poll, I wasn't in charge of the representation review, but I know a lot about it, and I'll speak very quickly to those matters now. So 2012, there was wide public consultation in Wairoa on the issue of Māori wards, the matter of Māori wards. So council, much like what Gisborne District Council is doing now, is having a public conversation on Māori wards. There was a lot of public education around Māori wards, and I think that's probably one of the shortcomings in respect of Māori wards in the nation at the moment. There's not enough education underpinning Māori wards to enable people to make you know, a really educated decision about Māori wards and whether they support them or not. The local authority, also Wairoa District Council, decided not to establish Māori wards, so just the status quo. And their status quo is 6 councillors elected at large and a mayor elected at large, so there's 7 people on their council. However, they received a valid poll demand of 5% of electors, was only 265 signatures, and it was a standalone poll. So what I mean by a standalone poll, it wasn't connected to an existing election process, it was a unilateral poll. And the votes received were against 52%. The other thing to note about a standalone poll, traditionally, because it's not connected with an election, you don't get as great a voter turnout. Whereas if you attach it to election, by and large, because of the fact that it is election, you get a greater turnout, and you'll see the impact of that potentially on the 2016 poll. So Māori wards weren't established in Wairoa District for the 2013 and 2016 elections. So the poll was binding on both of those elections. Fast forward 2016, again, there was a robust council debate on the issue of Māori wards. However, on that occasion, council made the decision to hold a poll of electors, and they attached it to their 2016 election process. A number of drivers for that was to maximise democratic participation. So as I said earlier, if you hold a unilateral poll or a standalone poll, you don't tend to get as many voters turn out for it. However, if you're in an election process and you add a poll, your numbers tend to go up. Also cost savings. Obviously, if you run a standalone poll and it's only on a single issue, it's going to cost you more. For example, here in Gisborne, if we had a single poll, standalone poll, it's about $65,000 plus GST to hold a poll. And obviously those costs come down if they're coupled with an election. And council's other driver there was to provide future certainty on Māori wards or not. The votes received, so on that occasion, binding poll 54%. And it's binding on 2019, so they had their first Māori wards in 2019 at last year's election. Okay, so then they had to hold a rep review after their poll results, and where they landed with that was, again, they kept the same number of councillors, 6 councillors, 3 councillors for the general ward. And the ward is basically an overlapping ward. So general ward, the whole district, 3 councillors elected at large. And then the Māori ward, following the same boundaries, elected at large, 3 councillors, and of course the mayor. So Wairoa has a fairly clean election process. They have the general ward and the Māori ward, and they have followed the same boundaries, and they have the mayor. That's me. I'm happy to take questions. Kia ora.
Ko te painga o tō kauhau i whai wāhi ngā whakautu ki reira. So thank you for that. One of the good things about your presentation is in the FAQ section, you answered a lot of the questions that I was writing down at the same time. So if you need to, like I will later on, please re-watch some of that information, because there's a lot in there that will actually answer a lot of the questions that you may have. Janic, I'm going to throw to you a quick question. This question here is basically, building more homes means more rates. Why don't we just do that?
That's a really good question. Building more homes does mean more rates for the community, and that's a good thing. It's really just a matter of how we support that development process, I guess, and that's the rub of the equation. In some ways, it sort of draws on some of the other questions as well, in particular Councillor Woolsnop's question and around whether we actually borrow first and then we apply the targeted rate to the development area. That's a tool in our toolbox. So local government does have the ability to do that, but not through the development contribution tool, but the financial contribution tool, and that's an RMA tool. But yes, and then essentially what you're doing is you're building the infrastructure first, and then you're requiring a targeted rate as a pay-to-play. So they're basically buying into the system. Development contributions are sort of forward focused, whereas financial contributions are retrospective. So that's the key difference between those two tools. And I guess the trick is really knowing which one you're going to go for, because you can't run the risk of double dipping. So you can't charge a DC and then require a financial contribution for the same activity. So you've got to be quite clear in terms of what you're trying to do. Added to that as well is that previous government took the ability for local government to gain a financial contribution away from the RMA, and then they've returned it. So it's back on the mix, and it's definitely something that we should consider as an option going forward. In some ways, it makes it a lot easier because you take the forecasting component out of the equation. So you're not crystal ball gazing so much. You're not relying so much on what you're expecting or what you're forecasting to happen in the future. You build it, and then you know exactly how much infrastructure you've built and how much it costs, and then you can spread the load of that cost across the community as you feel fit.
Can I just add to that? Can you split it? Can you go half and half DCs and half financial contributions?
I can't see any reason why you couldn't, but you just have to be very clear from an auditing perspective that your costs are very clearly defined. And that's where I guess the challenge is. There's nothing technically stopping council from doing that.
I'm just going to stop everyone there. This has been a very informative online hui, and I just want to remind everyone who probably didn't get their question answered this time to maybe rewatch a bit of the kōrero. Also send your questions to feedback@gdc.govt.nz. Check out our early engagement on the long-term plan at gdc.govt.nz. You can also find the links of how to go through and give us your feedback. And thank you all, and I'll be rewatching again later. Tēnā tātou.